What I want to do today is I want to tell you about a novel unsupervised machine learning method for scoring free response questions. So what that means is, given the text of student answers, so all the answers to an exam essay question, and nothing more, it can produce a ranked list of answers that more closely match the order given by a human grader than a random shuffle. So I want to give you an idea of what to expect sort of over our next little time together. And hopefully this is going to be a really fun journey. What I've done is I've structured it like a murder mystery. So we're going to start off by sort of telling you the results. We're going to start off with the end state, and then we're going to work our way back to see how exactly it was done. So I suspect that many of you, if not from my previous statement, from where we're about to go, are going to respond with some variation on, wait, you can grade essays based on just the text of the answers without a model answer or any external context? Impossible. And I hope that's where everyone's at, because that makes it a fun ride. What we'll do is we're going to start off with some background to help you understand how such a thing might be possible. And then I'm going to describe the specifics of the approach. And if I've done my job right, at the end, you're going to be like, oh, well, of course, that's simple. And so I really hope I've got you on the like, no, you can't do that. So just to drive that home, well, first then I'll say at the very end, then we'll discuss sort of next steps. But to drive home what I'm talking about here, I want to be very clear about what I mean by a free response question. So this is actually text from one of the free response questions that we dealt with. And as you can see, for those of you sort of familiar with American law or Anglo, you can see here that this is a standard sort of property question. And it has the famous rule of perpetuities in it. So this is a standard question that a lot of law students in the States will see. And you can see it's a proper question, sort of asks, what's going on in this fact pattern. So it says, Oliver's here, he was granted something about the land, blah, 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 tell us what happened. And this is what I mean by the answers. So the answers to this particular question averaged about 400 words in length. And here are the first pages of 3 examples of texts that we got in answer to that original prompt. This was sort of on the shorter side for the text we dealt with. The text that we dealt with in the whole corpus usually averaged around 1,500 words. So what we're saying here is that if we start with a random ordering of answers to a question, so if we have a bunch of those answers, those texts that we saw before, and we just have them randomly, well, obviously we know that there's some there's some way that someone can order those answers, and we would call it graded. So there's some ideal order that one can get from a human grader. And so here I've used colors, that sort of spectrum of colors to sort of give you an idea of the order. And so you can see there's the ideal order there with the human grader, and you can see that the random order doesn't quite look like the ideal order. In fact, it is a random order. I had lots of fun making these slides. I did little random lists, and it was all sorts of fun. The claim here is that there is an algorithm, and we're going to talk about this specific algorithm that we can apply to that random set of answers. And we can use the algorithm to score those answers and then to order them such that the order they produce when you order them by their scoring is closer to the human produced order than to a random ordering. Okay, so I want to be very clear about what we mean when we're saying, we're having something that's scoring, we're having something we feed in the text, we get a score, we then order them by those scores, and that order is going to be closer to the human order than to a random shuffle. That's what we're shooting for. That's our goal. I also want to be clear that this order is going to be demonstrably better than random. So here, just to make it a little easier to sort of see the order there, here's the numbers associated with what they would be in the grading rank, the human ranking. And so you can see the difference between the top and the bottom there, the random and our method. So you might ask, well, how can we actually tell that one order is better than another? The method that I opted to use was to count the adjacent swaps that you have to make. So if you think about that first set of answers, you can see they're not in the same order as the human. And so you can say, well, how could I make them there if my rule was I could only take two answers that were next to each other and swap them. If that's my constraint, then I have to do a bunch of different swaps before I can get that first list to look like the middle list. In fact, I have to do 19 swaps to get that random list to look like that human list. And for the list down at the bottom, I only have to do 5 swaps. Now, these are not the numbers from the actual data we ran through. We'll get to those later, but this is an illustrative example with just 11 texts so that you could see sort of how it looks. So this is what we're going to look at. We're going to look at the number of swaps needed to convert the ordering of our answers into the human, the ordering that you would get from the human answers. And so just to sort of show you that we're really going to get somewhere. If you do that for all, you count the swaps for the pseudo random, because it's not, I think it really be, well, we can't really be random. It's a pseudo random shuffle of the answers. If you count the number of swaps it takes to get that to the human order, and you count the number of swaps it takes to get the algo's ordering to the human order, we do find that it's statistically different. Statistically significant, the difference, which is specifically to say that someone's entered a waiting room. Okay, sorry. We say that we can actually calculate, we can take those swaps, run them as 2 different populations, we put them through a paired t-test, and we can actually come back and we can see that the p-value is very low, 0.000001. And the effect size, as measured by Cohen's d, is actually pretty large. You don't have to actually understand exactly what a p-value is, or what a paired t-test is to appreciate the rest of this. So I don't want you to be scared off, like, oh no, we're going into super detailed land. If you do, that's just there to help you realize that we're really talking about something that actually has some signal there. And I want to really be clear about what we're talking about here. We're talking about, we have a random set of answers. That's the input. That's the whole input. We don't need to know what the question is. We don't need to know what the topic is, or even what the correct answer looks like. We just need the text of each answer. And we're going to get ourselves this algo that's going to give us a sort of list. So hopefully people are like, I don't believe you. That's crazy. We can't do that. Well, let's see how it is. Is this magic? No, it's math. Okay. So to understand how this is possible, consider the following. If you're running a competition to guess the number of candies in a jar, or the weight of a cow, the average of the guesses is probably close to the right answer. This is often attributed to the wisdom of crowds. It doesn't always work. Certain conditions have to be present, but it works on the average. The thing is, human judgment can be wrong in a lot of ways, and there are more ways to be wrong than right. And this observation is sometimes called the Anna Karenina principle, named for the first line of Tolstoy's novel. Happy families are alike. All happy families are all alike. Every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. So it's easy to see how this helps us with numeric predictions, right? Like the count of candies or guessing a cow's weight. Some folks guess too high, others too low. And if there's a diversity of wrong answers, the different wrong answers cancel each other out when things are average. Here's actually a graph from a replication of Francis Galton's Vox Populi paper done by a radio podcast here in the US. And it's looking at the a group of folks, asking them to guess the weight of a cow. And then in Galton's famous paper, it was an ox at a fair. And so you can see some people guess too high, some people guess too low. The average answer, though not exactly right, was actually not so bad. We can even see how this would work if we were looking at answers with 2D targets. So we thought of like bullseyes. Bias is going to pull some folks off to one side. Noise is going to scatter things. And if there are enough people with different biases, the different ways of being wrong cancel each other out, such that the middle, or the average of hits, is close to the bullseye. But how the heck do we do this for text answers? Well, first we have to remember that when people, a lot of times I think when people think of the average answer to a test, they often mean an answer with the average grade, like sort of a mediocre answer. That's not what we're looking for. That's not the average of the answers. We're looking for the average of the answers, not the average answer. So in order to do that, it would be really helpful if we had a way to turn words into numbers. That way we actually could find an average of the answers. Luckily, there are many such methods. The trick is finding the right one. So I'm sure many of you will be familiar with this, and some of the other papers have just talked about Word2Vec as like a thing that everyone knows what it is. But I wanted to make sure that we were inclusive of everyone's different backgrounds here. So I'm going to do a really quick explanation of Word2Vec as one of the ways you can turn words into numbers. So we're going to take a little detour, and some of you have probably heard of logistic regression. So it's a way to fit an equation. In this case, it's the logistic equation there. You see there, the blue line. It's a way to fit an equation to a set of data such that an input, like X in this case, can be mapped to an output. In this case, and specifically in a logistic regression, to map to an output between 0 and 1. So actually what you see here is data, some simulated data for snowfall. The x-axis is the number of inches of accumulated snow here in Massachusetts, and you see those. You see sort of 1 inch, somewhere between 1 and 2 inches, 2 inches, 3 inches. Those are considered those data points, and whether or not they line up on the y is whether or not school or university was canceled because the snow was so bad people couldn't get in, which is something that happens with some frequency here in the Northeast. So the things up on the 1 are times when school was canceled. The things with down on the 0 were when they weren't. So what you see is that logistic function there is saying that basically you see that there's something that happens there, sort of between 3 and 7 inches. If we get more than that, then it's pretty likely that school is going to be closed. And all we're doing is we're just taking a function, we're mapping in some inputs, and we're mapping it to an output. Because of the fact that it's between 0 and 1, we can sort of interpret that as a likelihood. So 1 being 100%, 0 being 0%, and then 0.5 being 50% of the odds of closing. So that's just a logistic regression. You're like, well, wait a second, why are we talking about logistic regressions? Well, an important thing to understand is that a logistic regression can take multiple inputs. Okay, so we can take in not just the accumulation of snow, but maybe say the minimum temperature, okay, or the maximum temperature, right? So like, is it going to get hot enough to melt things? And you just put that into the function, and you can. The important thing is, as in this this picture here, you have to sort of fiddle with the knobs, which is to say the weights of in the equation. So there are numbers in the equation which get multiplied by the input or inputs, and that's going to determine sort of how vertical that sort of squiggle is, how wide it is, where it's shifted on the x-axis. So the key is that you can train these logistic regressions such that the inputs come in and then give you an output the way you like. And sometimes you'll be able to find something that works pretty well, and sometimes you won't. But the point is, all you're doing is changing those numbers you're multiplying by your inputs. And so this is what you can have multiple inputs, and you can have an arbitrary number of them. So you can have, here we have 3. So maybe we did max temperature, minimum temperature, and accumulation to figure out our, is school closed? Well, what happens if we have multiple functions to which we feed all of our inputs? I think this is interesting. Like, we're connecting things together here. So we're going to take those same 3 inputs, and we're going to give them, in this case, to 2 things which I've made look sort of like logistic regressions, because at the end of the day, you're going to see where this is going. But it's effectively like a logistic regression. Numbers come in, so any number on the number line, for temperature or accumulation, they go in through these little boxes, and we're putting out a value between 0 and 1. And so here's an interesting thing. What if I connect another function? So let's take 2 functions and feed their outputs into a third. Well, now we have something you might recognize as a neural net. Now, modern neural nets don't use a logistic function anymore, and sometimes you get outputs between -1 and 1. But if you squint, it's pretty close. My hope is that for the folks who have a deep understanding of neural nets, that they're like, yeah, that's sort of close. And for everyone else, that it's like, oh, that sort of makes sense to me. So we're trying to thread that needle there. So if you squint, it's pretty close. So you can feed in some arbitrary amount of numbers into a set of functions, and out pops a number between 0 and 1. And so just like our original logistic function, each of our output terms has a weight associated with it. And if you set these weights just right, you can train these functions to produce a certain output for a given set of inputs. We won't get into how, but hopefully you can see that there is some set of weights, some set of numbers you could multiply these things by within those little functions that's going to get you an answer that's going to perform better on sort of this prediction task of, will school be closed than other weights. So the key is figuring out how to fiddle those weights. We don't need to get into that now. I'm going to tell you something. This is real fun. Now here's a really cool trick discovered by Melkov et al. In 2013. This is how you get a word to vect. So now you have basically that same architecture. It's not quite logistic regressions, but it's the same idea. Imagine you have a corpus of text, like all the text you could find on Wikipedia or the web, and you give each one of those things a thing here on the left here. You either have a 0 or a 1 based upon whether or not you're talking about a particular word. You feed them into another set of neurons, and then they feed back out to some outputs. And it's the same as on the input. So it's the same list of words. And what you're trying to do is you're going to train this thing such that the number you get on the outputs is the likelihood that that word will be next to the word you put in. So in this case, I obviously trained it on a corpus of movies. So we've got I'll Be Back for Schwarzenegger fans, and Let It Go for anyone with small children, such as myself. And we can see here that in this example, we're saying that if I feed in the word be, well, there's a 0.45 chance that it will be next to the word I'll or back, but not very likely that it'll be back to let it go. And if I feed in the word it, there's a similar chance that it'll be next to let or go, but not next to I'll be back. So what does this have to do with anything? Well, the point is, it turns out that if you just take the weights associated with the central layer, so the sort of things that you're putting all these things in, and it was giving these values between 0s and 1, which are going to be fed to the next layer. If you just take those, you get some great numbers. So you end up with something like a 300-dimensional. You tend to, like, here I have 3, and word2vec that you tend to choose something like 300. So you got 300-dimensional vector. And so basically every word gets a set of 300 numbers. And what's really cool is that there's structure to this. There's a lot of famous examples that people will talk about. They'll say, well, basically, so now we have 300 numbers we can associate with every word. Well, the interesting thing is you can plot those in some 300-dimensional space. That's they don't really know what that looks like in your mind, but here's a 3D space. And here's the example that normally gets used. So for every word, there's a point in that space. Well, so the classic example is that if you take the word king, or the point for the word king, and you subtract from it the location of the word man, and then you add to it the number for the word woman, then you end up in a place really close to the word queen. Now, it's a bit of a fudge. It turns out that you actually end up at a place really close to the word king, but you exclude the word that you originally put in. But the point is that these words are in this 300-dimensional space such that similar words are close to each other. So it relies on the fact that how words exist in this corpus of text you had. Since word2vec, there have been a number of similar methods created for producing since what's called dense vectors. But the key insights are that these embeddings, which is what we call them, seem to capture some shadow of the word's meanings, and they allow us to do math with our words. So as such, they present a promising path for us to average words. We can move from individual words to full SIs by adding up and averaging the word2vec embeddings for each word. And for a collection of answers in such a space, we can think of their average as their center. And just as we did with the bullseye, we can infer maybe that this average is close is doing a lot of work in this sentence, but close to the right answer. And we can say that the closer the answer is to this centroid, this center of all of these things, so all of the essays, we plot each of the essays and we say, where's the center? We can say that closer the answer is to this center, the better it is in some sense. And so we can then just rank answers by seeing how far they are from the centroid. And so in this way, we can actually score a set of exam answers without ever having to define a correct answer, based only on the text of all the answers, assuming a couple of things are true. One, we can map the text into the right space, right? So you have to have a question for which the thing you care about is something we can capture in something like Word2Vec. Two, which we capture something like a shadow of the meaning. Two, we have to make sure that everyone is answering the same question. That is, right answers look similar. So if I said, write a creative story, short story, the semantic similarity, which is the thing we can capture with Word2Vec, so the meaning of things, is going to be different for everyone's story. So there, the answers are not going to look similar. So that's not going to work for us. The answers have to look similar. And then there have to be enough diversity in the answers so that wrong answers cancel each other out. And so that sort of means you need to have sort of more people than less, and there needs to be sort of a diversity of things. These are the classic problems with the sort of the wisdom of crowds, right? If you get mob mentality and everyone's thinking the same way, then obviously averaging their answers doesn't work. We can even take these distances we measure from the centroid, and we can produce standard grading based on them. So we actually can take like the z-scores, which is like a measure of how far they are off the standard dev. So imagine measuring everything's distance from the centroid, figuring out what the mean distance is, and then setting that to, C or B plus or whatever your grade inflation is. You could also map it, these z-scores, which is just a measure of how far off the standard, how many standard devs off we are from the mean. You could map those to pass fails, and you could say everything, that's, more than -1 standard dev is a pass, or whatever you wanted to say. So we're left with a couple of things on how to do this algo. So we have a pretty simple, or at least straightforward when you talk about it, method for scoring answers to free response questions. First, we produce an embedding for each answer that captures as much of the relevant information as possible. So in this case, we used Word2Vec. Then we find the centroid of all of those embeddings. Remember that embedding is the number it has in this multi-dimensional space. So when you find the centroid for all the embeddings in your population of answers, and we impute the location of the correct model as sort of that center of all those answers. And then we measure the distance between each answer's embedding and the correct answer. Here I actually say, either the centroid or the metoid, and that would be the one actual answer that was there that was closest to the centroid. We can talk about that more if we have time. And then we convert the answer's distance, the answer's distances from the model answer into z-scores for the population of answers, and we translate into some node grading scale. So one thing to know is we should remember the sage advice of George Box. He said all models are wrong, but some are useful. So here Box is speaking about statistical models, but consider the humble map. Maps are models of the world. They don't show everything, so in some sense they're all wrong. But when used correctly, they can be quite useful. Remembering that models are wrong leads us to treat their outputs as the start of a discussion, not the end. That is, we shouldn't take their output as the ground truth, as the absolute end all and be all. So we also have to determine if a model is useful by asking compared to what. And so that's going to be two things I want us to remember as we zoom through these last bits here. So let's consider what we know about the limitations of embeddings such as Word2Vec. For one thing, they're not very good at idiomatic language. I call this problem the elephant in the room. Because I used an idiom to explain the problem. The fact that everyone's muted and I can't hear if you're laughing, a little tough, but I'm going to assume at least a chuckle. So they're not very good at idiomatic language. So if most people answer a question absent idioms, the one person who makes use of them may be seen as an outlier, which is to say that they're not going to, there's not a lot of semantic similarity between the phrase, the elephant in the room, and the problem, which no one is talking about it, but everyone is aware of, right? Those two sentences don't mean the same thing unless you have this broader context, which these models don't have. Another problem is that of negation. So saying that something, if I say, Socrates is not a man, is very similar to Socrates as a man, as far as, if you add up each of those words, sort of where they would show up in that word space. So this means that any particular use of this method should pay special attention to outliers, perhaps prioritizing them for human review. So you're going to look at those outliers first because there's a chance they might not be right. Hopefully that frees you up, though. That's really where you put your focus. You don't have to put as much focus on things closer to the mean or above. Likewise, we have to be sure that we know what we're comparing our method to. There's no way it's as good as a human grader, but maybe it can help a grader's job make it easier. Law schools are notorious, at least in the States, for basing grades on a single high-stakes final exam. Despite the proven benefits of frequent formative assessment, so asking someone they're thinking during the process and giving them feedback, they're rarely deployed. So why is that? Well, that's because law school classes are large and grading questions is hard. So my hope is that this tool can take a first pass at scoring to remove some of that friction. And who knows, maybe it'll be enough to promote more formative assessment. But we'll come to that in a minute. So how much better than random is this machine scored ranking? We're looking at 1,000 plus answers across 6 law schools, 13 questions. We look at these the neighbor swaps as a measure. So we did this here for these classes. So here are just the top line numbers. So here's a property exam, question 1. This is the question actually that we saw earlier. So the difference between the random was, and actually what I did here is that's the random, that's the swaps on 100,000 random shuffles. Okay, so that's the sort of average of 100,000 random shuffles, how many swaps was needed. And then we have 1,002 on the algo. And we just go through and we can go through all of them. And one of the nice things you notice is that the machine graded ones are always lower than the pseudo random. And so the question is, how good is it? Well, as you saw before, when we look at the pseudo random shuffle as the untreated group and the machine scoring as a treatment, we can pretty easily reject the null hypothesis that the machine scoring is just a random shuffle, right? These are not the same lists. And furthermore, if we were like in medical treatment, that effect size, we'd be calling that large. It's a pretty large effect size. It's like a 30 to 40% difference between the two in the number of swaps. So keeping Box's quote in mind, how can we use this? I think that one thing that might be interesting is to be able to put it into a grading system that sort of distributes things into a set of columns like this, and then you can easily sort of move things between columns to get them to the proper ordering and give them the proper grading. And so the idea is that instead of having to sift through everything, because you just sort of randomly throw them in, you sort of have an idea of where they're at, and then you can move them around. I did this in one of my classes. It did tend to, this is not the subject of the paper, so I don't have hard numbers for this, but from sort of my own experience, that did seem to make things a little easier. That would obviously be one of the things we would want to look at in future research. I want to be really careful about cautions here. You could make things too easy. There's a chance that graders could rely too heavily on this first pass, sort of abdicating their responsibilities. So a lot more work is needed before the method's sort of applied broadly. I think it could be helpful in assisting the grading process. And I think that's probably about our time. We're running over a little before and we're going into the break, so I don't want to hold people too long unless there are questions. My real hope is that this could help promote formative assessment by making it easier for people to ask questions and then grade them and get stuff back to people. I have a lot of other things we could talk about as we look to the horizon. It wasn't just Word2Vec. We also looked at the Dilbert, Roberta, other ways of vectorizing words. They all were significant when compared to random. And there's probably a lot of room for improvement here by adding feature engineering, choosing different embeddings, and doing some parameter tuning. What you saw, the results here, were just the first thing I tried. I didn't want to be accused of torturing the data, so that was the first thing, and I bet we could actually probably get it a lot better. And if there are any questions, I would love to hear them.
Yeah, we have a question. Thanks, David, for the very interesting project. We have a question from Corina.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for the very engaging talk.
Thank you.
So I was wondering, you're currently scoring automatically or trying to score automatically, and for students to accept their grade and also for the grading to be formative and to be actually useful feedback, one would be looking for some kind of explanation. So have you thought, I bet you have thought about how you could create automated explanations for the scores, perhaps especially from the word embeddings, since these vectors kind of carry some information. So what are your thoughts in that direction?
Yeah, I haven't thought a lot about that. The one thing I do want to make very clear, I think if someone was to use this method without a human reviewing the answers at the end, it would be malpractice. So I want to make that very clear. This is a tool to be used by a human grader to help them in their grading, not a tool to replace them. And so in that case, my hope would be that the first iteration would be something that would allow a human grader to actually deal with a lot more answer, to actually do the assessment, where before they'd be scared of, even trying. And so that would be the first answer. So that's sort of like the easy answer. And this is where I get to say, well, this is the first paper on it, and there's a lot of room for future. And I really like that suggestion. But I do want to push back on the idea of like entirely automating away the grader. It's especially important when you think about like the elephant in the room problem. So actually the first time I did this with the students, there was one particular question where everyone answered it in sort of the normal way and it worked pretty well, but there's this one outlier like way down there. And they had basically just said, I asked them to summarize something about a reading and what was someone saying. And they had basically just said, well, the person's complaining that so-and-so doesn't see the forest for the trees, which turned out to be the exact right answer to summarize that person's views of things. But of course, it was an idiomatic answer that the Word2Vec did not recognize. And so it was way out there. So you really need that person to be able to look at that and to say, oh yeah, that actually is a good answer. And then to be able to incorporate the appropriate feedback. But yeah, a good idea for the future. But yeah, really just about right now giving a cognitive exoskeleton to human graders.
Well, can I quickly push back on that in the sense that,
yeah.
So I wasn't suggesting to automate like all of the reviewing process, but you could think that this feedback or the positive and negative points of the deviations, like some kind of low dimensional summary of where the answers differ, kind of to be added to your grading system, like below, as explanations also to the person then reviewing the automated grading could be helpful. So I think that's kind of the that I was doing.
I think that could be interesting, like something like we saw from one of yesterday's talks with some of the attention mechanisms used to highlight what portions of the text were the ones that were sort of driving why it looked like a deviation. So that might be really interesting to have something where it highlights like, this looks pretty good, but like over here, what's going on? I would like that as a tool for the grader to sort of click into. I just think we're so far away from it being able to automatically be, unless I could imagine a scenario where if it was something where the stakes of false positives were arranged such that, so basically you're just doing like a pass, like a did you do it or did you not do it sort of thing, you could set the threshold such that maybe it would be reasonable to have a very light human touch, which is just like, oh, let's look at the ones that said they were failed, make sure they weren't actually failed, and then move them forward. But so it's very fact specific. But yeah, I like that idea of drawing some attention to folks. And cognitive exoskeleton, I see Brian like that in the chat. That's not my term. That's Mark Lawrenson's term for just sort of a lot of the sort of helping tools that people have built for attorneys. But it really sort of captures the sense, I think.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, yeah. I also really like things comment there now. I'm seeing that in there as well. I like the use of a meme and a curve comment in there as well.
So we have a question from the chat from Jason Morris, I believe, and then we have one in the audience, Nicholas. And we'll just take these two questions. Then,
sure.
Yes. So maybe Jason's one first.
Let's see. Is there a risk here that what we are measuring is not whether good answers express the same idea, but whether they express the same idea in the same way? And is there any evidence for your data that inconsistencies as compared to human graders are clustering among answers the algorithm takes as bad? So I think that actually is, yes, there is such a risk, and that is exactly the risk posed by the elephant in the room problem and by the negation problem. I think you mitigate that to some extent by using something like these text embeddings that don't require that you have to use the exact same words. So if we were using something like a term frequency inverse document frequency as a way to turn our words into numbers, then then there you'd have to actually like get the exact right words, right? So at least you have a little fuzziness here because you have some shadow of the semantic meaning. But yeah, I think that is definitely a concern, and that is the reason why it would be malpractice to use this without human oversight. So good question.
Thank you for your talk. It was really interesting. Just a quick question. Maybe you talked about it and I just missed it. But did you also compare the deviations between different human graders to the deviations between human graders and the computer?
I did not do that in this paper, but I think that would be really interesting, because there is some research and reason to believe that actually there isn't as much agreement between human graders as we would like to think there should be. So I think that would be really interesting, because some of you might be now like, oh, okay, this makes it so that it's, you look at those numbers swaps and you're like, well, this is not exactly giving me the answer. So how good is it? We know how good it is compared to random. How good is it compared to a person? I think that would be a natural next step. The thing to understand is, so all these, we get all these, we have processes we go through for human subject research. So these all went through that. We then also had to convince professors to share their exams and to share their grades. I don't know, it'd be an interesting question to say, okay, well, it was one thing to say, let us compare how well you grade against an algorithm and random. It might be another one to see like, well, how well do you compare to other graders? The worry being that maybe we aren't as coherent as we think we are. And it turns out that actually this algorithm that looks maybe not so great is actually pretty good compared to people. I don't know. It's an open question. I think it's definitely an area I'd like to look more at. So the answer was no. I could have just said no. We didn't do that yet.